Hello and welcome to Child Development. My name is Chris Boydis and I am your instructor. We're going to be covering Chapter 1 in this video lecture. So let's go over some learning objectives. First thing, we're going to talk about how the study of children, and because each child is unique, can that study be an actual science? Well, the answer is yes, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about how ethnic groups can make a difference in child's development. We're going to talk about how childhood today is really quite different than it was 50 years ago. And how can we know what changes between 1 year of life and the next? In other words, what should we expect with a 1-year-old, with a 3-year-old, with a 5-year-old? And finally, is it unethical to study children scientifically? Let's start out by talking a little bit about the science of human development. Well, human development and psychology development is actually a science. It's multidisciplinary, it leads to practical applications, and it's based on objective evidence. So what are we doing? Well, we're seeking to understand how and why people of all ages and circumstances change or remain the same over time. Let's get started talking about the scientific method. And the scientific method is a way to answer questions using empirical research and data-based conclusions. There's basically 5 steps that we use for the scientific method. The first, we begin with a question. So you observe something and you have a question about it. You then develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis can also be thought of as a prediction. We then test our prediction or our hypothesis. So we run an experiment. We then draw conclusions. In other words, was your hypothesis correct or not, or maybe some of the time, and then we report on the results. And one of the things with developmental psychology, in fact psychology in general, is to keep in mind that the scientific method is really a process. So you learn something and then you test it, and then we build upon what we've just learned and we test it maybe slightly differently, or we look at different angles of it. So think of the scientific method as something that we are just forever building upon.
So having said that, just keep in mind that the quote final step in this process is replication, although often replication leads to new studies and new observations, and it continues to grow upon itself. So let's switch gears a little bit. I want to remind you of the nature-nurture controversy, and this is something that you would have heard about in general psychology. It is especially important when we're talking about developmental psychology. So let's review. The nature part of this controversy refers to the influence of the genes that you inherit. Nature refers to biology. The nurture part is the environmental influences that affect development. So what is the controversy? Well, the controversy is which impacts more. There are people who are extremists and they believe that who you are is completely dependent upon the genes that you've inherited. And then there's other people who believe that who you are is completely dependent upon the situations or the experiences that you have had while you were growing up. Well, the truth of the matter is, and what most people believe, is that the two interact. So nature always impacts nurture, and nurture always impacts nature.
So let's talk a little bit about how nature and nurture interact. So some people are more vulnerable to specific diseases, to specific illnesses. It has a lot to do with your genetic makeup. So people differ in their susceptibility to environmental influences because of particular inherited genes. So we have 2 identical twins here. It could just be one. It doesn't really matter. But we have twins. And let's say they have a genetic disposition toward aggression. For whatever reason, they have both parents who are highly aggressive, although these kids look adorable, but let's just pretend. Well, they might be genetically predisposed to having difficulties with aggression because of their genes. And then if we put them in a specific environment that also, let's say they're growing up with their parents who are very aggressive and they see their parents being very aggressive, well, those two, the nature and the nurture, interact, and now we have children who are more likely to be aggressive than not. I know it seems like I'm skipping around a lot, but your first chapter covers a lot of different topics, and I just want to cover the highlights of those. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the domains of human development. And your book breaks it down into three different domains. Each domain includes several academic disciplines. For example, the biosocial includes biology, neuroscience, and medicine. The cognitive includes psychology, linguistics, education, and the psychosocial includes economics, sociology, and history. Typically, each scholar follows a particular thread within one domain, using cues and conclusions from other scientists who've concentrated on that same thread. Let's go over a couple of definitions. The first being culture, and culture refers to a system of shared beliefs, norms, and behaviors and expectations. These persist over time and they tend to prescribe social behaviors and assumptions. A good example of this would be here in America. If you were invited over to dinner, you would expect to sit at a table on a chair and have your own plate. If you're in a different culture, it might be completely normal to sit on the floor, to share a bowl amongst all of the guests, and to eat with your hands. One isn't better than the other, they're just different cultures, and there's different expected social behaviors with each. Ethnic group has to do with people who have ancestors that were born in the same region, and they often share a language, a culture, and a religion. Race has to do with a group of people who regard themselves or they're regarded as others as distinct from a group. This is usually on the basis of physical appearance and typically skin color. Socioeconomic status has to do with your access to resources and how many resources you have. So we could have people that are in the same culture, ethnic group, and race all living within a community, but they also could be of the same socioeconomic status, or you could have people that had different economic status. It really has to do with how much, usually money or how many resources they have, what they can access, what they can buy, those types of resources. I want to talk a little bit about critical periods and sensitive periods. So, critical periods is a period of time when something needs to happen, and if it doesn't happen during that time, then it's too late. So, a good example of that is humans. So, if we look at an embryo, the embryo grows arms, legs, hands, feet, fingers, toes, all those great things. Well, they tend to be developed between 28 and 54 days after conception. If that does not happen, let's just pretend for whatever reason our left arm does not grow. You will not then give birth to a baby whose arm will grow later. It needs to happen during that period of time. Between 28 and 54 days, all these things need to happen. If they're disrupted, then what we would normally expect to happen does not. A sensitive period is a time when certain types of development occurs more easily, although it still may happen later with difficulty. So examples of a sensitive period, language is one of them. If children do not start speaking the first language between ages 1 and 3, they tend to have difficulty learning to speak later, which is why it is so important to test toddlers and infants on hearing, because let's say that there was a hearing difficulty and the toddler, we didn't diagnose it. The toddler is not hearing language. Well, that is a sensitive period. That does not mean that at age 5 we couldn't have some occupational therapy, some speech therapy, and teach that child to speak, but it is much, much more difficult. And the other thing, the reason I have a picture of a cat is actually a fairly well-known study where we covered the eye of a kitten for 3 weeks. So the kittens are born, we cover one eye. After the 3 weeks, we take the cover off. Those kittens do not learn how to use the eye that was covered. So it is critically important that kittens, they can see with both eyes from day one. If we stop that development, then they're going to have visual difficulties. So one of the theories that we talk about in this class is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems approach. And I want to go over this a little bit. You probably also had this in general psych, but just to remind you so we're ready to go with this class. Urie Bronfenbrenner came up with a system. And basically what he was saying is each person is affected by many social contexts and interpersonal reactions. We are all nested and surrounded by individuals that affect us. This approach later became the bioecological theory. So let's go over the 5 different systems that Bronfenbrenner identified, and then I'll give you examples of each. So the microsystem. The microsystem is elements of your immediate surroundings. So this would be your family, groups that, let's say you're involved with a church group or some sort of sporting group. Those are your microsystems. Those are things that you're directly involved with. Your ecosystems, these are local institutions. So an ecosystem would be HAC, it would be a school, it would be a church. The macrosystems, these are larger social settings, and these things include cultural values, economic policies, political processes. The mesosystem has to do with the connections between the other systems. And last, the chronosystem, and chrono, if you think of time chronologically, chronosystem, this emphasizes the importance of historical time.
So this picture gives you a very good idea of how all these systems are interrelated. And each person, what Bronfenbrenner believed, is each person is affected by the interactions among overlapping systems. And this provides the context of development. We can also look at people as part of the same cohort. And well, what is a cohort? A cohort is a group of people that are treated as a group. They tend to be born within the same historical period. They tend to move through life together. They experience the same events, new technologies, cultural shifts at the same ages, and they tend to have similar influences, attitudes, and behaviors. So now that we've done an overview of the chapter, I want to back up a little bit and go over the scientific method in a little bit more detail. For the purposes of this class, we're really going to talk about 3 different types of research or research designs. The first being the observation, then we're going to talk a little bit about the experiment, and finally the survey. So there are other variations of research designs, but these are the 3 that we're going to be talking about most in this class: observation, the experiment, and the survey. We'll start with what I think is probably one of the easier ones, scientific observation. And I think it's easier because it is exactly what it sounds like. We are observing. So this requires a researcher to record behavior systematically and objectively. And that is the key. It needs to be systematically and objectively. We are not putting our own spin on things. We are not interpreting things. We are being objective. This can happen in a naturalistic setting, or it could be a laboratory. So either is fine. A naturalistic setting might be that you go to the park, and as you're sitting on the bench watching kids play, they don't know that you're watching them, and you watch how often they pick their nose and touch somebody else within 5 seconds, and you count that. That would be scientific observation of nose picking and touching people. I don't know if they've done that study, but that's what it would be. In a laboratory, we would set up what would be a more artificial situation, but you can still observe how children or adults react given specific situation. And one of the things with scientific observation is we want to develop a hypothesis. We want to have, if my suggestion is during the winter, more kids will pick their nose and touch somebody than in the summer, well, then I would need to observe during the winter and the summer, but I would have a hypothesis in place. Next thing we're going to talk about is the experiment. And the experiment can establish causal relationships among variables. So if you remember back to general psychology, an observation or survey cannot suggest causality. You cannot say one thing causes another just by observing or just by doing a survey. The only time that you can say one thing causes another is if you do a true experiment. So the experiment is the one that you can say something causes something else.
There are variables, so the very base experiment would have an independent variable and a dependent variable. Remember from Gen Psych that the independent variable is what is introduced by the psychologist or by the researchers to see what effect it has on the dependent variable. The dependent variable always needs to be measurable, and it is the variable that may change as a result of whatever the new condition or situation the experimenter added. Another thing with the scientific method, just to remind you, there's often groups. We have an experimental group, and that is the group that gets a particular treatment. In other words, the independent variable is done to the people in the experimental group. And the comparison group, it's also sometimes called the control group. If you've heard either that comparison or control group, that is fine. And this is the group that does not get a treatment, and we're using that to compare to see if there is actually a difference between the two. So just have a visual diagram here of a basic experiment. So the first thing we're going to do is we have a group of people. We're going to divide them into experimental and control group. The best way to do that is randomly. You cannot systematically choose them because you could be your results could be biased. So we're going to randomly put them into an experimental group or control group. The experimental group will receive the independent variable, what they're calling here the special treatment. The comparison group or the control group does not. And then what we're looking for, the hypothesis, is that there will be some sort of change in whatever we're measuring with the experimental group, and we would not expect to have a change in the comparison or control group. The last type of study that we're going to talk about in this class is the survey. And this survey you've probably been familiar with. You've probably completed many a survey. And that includes information that's collected from a large number of people by interview, questionnaire, or some other means. At the end of this class or toward the end, you will be asked to do a survey on my teaching and a survey on the class organization, etc., etc. So a survey, the benefit of it is you can get the information from a large group of people, and it is fairly easy to do this. The downside of a survey is that you cannot say that one thing causes another. All you're doing is gathering information. So it is difficult with a survey to validate that the information is accurate because some people lie. People change their minds. People may not want to admit to something. So when they're doing a survey, you have to keep in mind that you may not be getting honest results. And survey answers can also be highly influenced by the wording or the sequence of questions. So these are all challenges of the survey method. So here's a good example of how a survey might give you misleading results. So the question is, did you have sexual intercourse before the age of 13? And we asked 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders this. Well, the first thing you should notice is that their answers are changing. Why is their answer changing? The other thing to keep in mind is as soon as you are asking people this question, is it socially acceptable to admit to having sex before the age of 13? Is it something that you want to? And in some groups, it really, really depends. It may be a status symbol. It may be something that people lie and said they did. It could be something that they lie and said they didn't. But anytime that you're asking questions, you really need to keep in mind that people may not be honest. So now that we've talked about different research types, let's talk a little bit about research design. The first being cross-sectional research. And cross-sectional research is when you take a group of people at one age and they're compared with people of another age. We also can do research over a long period of time. Longitudinal research is when you take the same individual and you do research on them again and again and again to see how their development goes. A good example of this is my mother has been in a research study. She agreed to be part of it when she was in her 20s and had just finished nursing school. 50 years later, every couple years, they contact her and she fills out a survey and she answers questions. And this has been a long-term, for 50 years, the study has been going on. So long-term. Then we also have cross-sequential research. And this is when we study several different groups of people of different ages, so that'd be cross-sectional approach, and then we follow them over the years. So the cross-sequential research is a combination of the other two. We are looking at people of different ages, cross-sectional, and then we're also going with the longitudinal research because we're following these people over time. Well, you're probably wondering which is best. So we have all these different types of research and we have different research methodology. Well, cross-sectional research, this is the most convenient. It is the quickest and is the least expensive way to study development. You can take a look at people at a given age and you can see what's going on with them. It is quick because you can do that relatively fast. Versus, remember I was saying with my mother, she's been in a study for 50 years. So if you're in a study, it's longitudinal and it is going on and on, that is expensive because you need to hire researchers that are going to be continuing that research over time. The problem with cross-sectional is it doesn't always indicate the processes of development. All you're doing is taking a cross-section of what is going on right now. You're not able to study that person as they age and what's going on. Longitudinal research can be useful in studying development over many years. You can uncover links that cross-sectional research does not. The problem being that it does take a lot more time, it could be going on for years and years and years, and it is resource intensive, which translates to expensive. So let's talk a little bit about correlation and causation. Correlation exists between two variables if one variable is more or less likely to occur when the other one does. So we have positive correlations, negative correlations, and zero correlation. A positive correlation is if one occurs, the other is more likely to occur. A negative correlation is if one occurs, the other is less likely to occur. Another way of putting this is as one goes up, the other one goes down. Zero correlation is when we cannot predict at all. We cannot say whether one is more likely to happen with another. There appears to be no correlation whatsoever. A good example of a zero correlation would be your grade and the color of sneaker that you are wearing. We would not find any sort of correlation. I cannot predict your grade based on your sneaker choice, so there would be a zero correlation.
So I imagine it feels like we went pretty fast through chapter 1, and a lot of that is because these concepts should be a review for you from general psychology. I encourage you to read the chapter very carefully before you take the quiz, and please let me know if you have any questions.